In medieval Europe, a woman's worth was tied tightly to her body, her purity, and her ability to bear children. But what happened when that body became a weapon in the eyes of men? We often hear of men being castrated, turned into eunuchs for royal service, punished through the loss of their manhood. But what they rarely teach you is that women too were subjected to something just as cruel. It was not surgical, it was not clean, it was punishment by mutilation, and its purpose was to strip a woman of her femininity, to silence her sexuality, to destroy her ability to reproduce, and to make her an example. These were not isolated cases across dungeons, courtrooms, and execution grounds, especially in times of war, religious paranoia, or male vengeance. Some women were subjected to unspeakable brutality, much of it aimed between their legs. When we hear the word castration, we often think of a knife, a man, and the removal of testicles. It is clean in definition, if not in practice. But when it comes to women, the term gets murky, even more brutal, and far more ignored. Female castration in the Middle Ages did not follow a strict definition because it was not a recognized legal punishment. It was not written into law books, or recorded like male castration. Instead, it existed in the shadows as a set of cruel practices driven by revenge, fear, and domination. So, what did it look like? Sometimes it meant the mutilation of the internal organs, the external genitals with sharp objects or irons. A woman accused of adultery, promiscuity, or even seduction could have her parts cut off, her body mutilated, or her genitals burned as a way of removing her sin. In these instances, the aim was clear: to punish the woman by targeting the very part of her body society believed caused temptation and shame. In other cases, tools of torture like red-hot tongs or searing rods were inserted into the vagina as part of public executions or confessions, especially during witch trials. This was not just physical pain, it was humiliation, a surgical erasure of womanhood carried out by men who believed they were purifying her soul or defending their honor. The term female castration is also used by some historians to describe forced sterilization or the removal of reproductive function, not through advanced medical surgery but through blunt trauma and torture. There are recorded incidents of women being beaten in the lower abdomen until they bled internally, or being impaled with objects that destroyed the uterus. All without anesthesia, all done as punishment. These acts were rarely documented in official court records, because they were not meant to be preserved. They were often carried out in dark dungeons, behind closed monastery doors, or at the whims of a powerful man with no one to answer to. But their impact was devastating, as these women were robbed of their ability to have children, stripped of their sexual identity, and branded as ruined both physically and socially. What makes it worse is that many of these women were never criminals in any real sense, as some were punished for being too beautiful, too outspoken, too independent, or for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong man's attention. This was not about justice, it was about control, a desperate, bloody attempt to control the one thing that terrified medieval men the most, a woman who knew her own power. In the Middle Ages, Europe was ruled not just by kings, but by beliefs that women were naturally weaker, morally fragile, and spiritually suspicious. Religious doctrine often painted women as the daughters of Eve, the original sinner, the one who led man astray. So in the eyes of the church and the law, a woman's body was not hers, it belonged to her father, her husband, or her God. And any woman who dared to break free of that control was seen not as brave, but as dangerous. Purity was everything. As a woman's virginity before marriage was guarded like treasure, her faithfulness in marriage was demanded without question, and her obedience to her husband, the priest, and society was enforced with an iron fist. When a man stepped out of line, he might be whipped, fined, or imprisoned, but when a woman defied expectations by cheating, rebelling, speaking too freely, or even being raped, she was often the one who got blamed and punished. In some places, adulterous women were paraded through the streets naked, their hair shaved off, their faces smeared with ash or excrement. In others, they were burned with hot irons, or forced to wear humiliating devices like the scold's bridle, a metal mask with a tongue clamp. But some punishments went even further, and when the goal was not just shame but destruction, her femininity itself became the target. Because in a society obsessed with control, Nothing was more threatening than a woman who owned her body. So female genital mutilation, though rarely written about, became a dark undercurrent in the enforcement of gender roles, whether by vengeful husbands, religious inquisitors, or sadistic torturers. Some women were mutilated in ways meant to erase their sexuality, fertility, and dignity all at once, and the worst part was that it was often done not in secret, but in public as a warning. This is what happens when a woman forgets her place. This was not just punishment, it was psychological warfare waged against half the population using their bodies as battlegrounds. And as we dig deeper into the brutal specifics, one thing becomes clear. They did not just want to hurt these women. They wanted to make them unwomen. In the Middle Ages, the witch trial became the darkest symbol of terror for women, a brutal mixture of religion, superstition, and hatred where being different was deadly. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, thousands of women were accused of witchcraft across Europe, and what began as whispers often ended in fire, rope, or iron. Before execution came interrogation, and torture became the church's weapon as inquisitors claimed the female body carried marks of evil that only pain could reveal. Women were stripped in cold stone chambers, their bodies examined by male clerics searching for imagined signs, while the torture grew invasive through sharp tools, red-hot rods, and searing irons used not just to force confessions but to destroy the part of the body they believed invited sin. These acts were justified as purification, turning mutilation into holy work and leaving women broken for crimes they never committed. A widow, a midwife, or a girl with a reputation for speaking freely could be accused, and once named a witch, her fate was almost always sealed. Even young girls were tortured, some dying before trial while others lived long enough to be burned. These trials were never about witches, they were about control, as society used them to silence women who did not obey or conform. Surviving mutilation was only the beginning, because the true punishment came afterward in whispers, isolation, and lifelong shame. In a world where a woman's worth depended on purity, obedience, and the ability to bear children, mutilated women were treated as ruined and unfit for marriage or respect. Many became outcasts, forced into convents, poor houses, or lonely roadsides where their suffering was treated as their own fault. The church offered little mercy because any woman marked sexually or robbed of fertility was seen as spiritually impure. Without support, many lived in silence, carrying trauma that could never heal while society erased them as if their pain proved their guilt. Some hid in religious vows while others lost their sanity or their lives, unable to survive a world that had stolen their identity.